Hi there, this is Phil with Phil Effects. Got another tutorial. Today we're going to talk about animation. And this tutorial, I'm not sure if this is going to break up into one or two tutorials, but I'm going to cover how you set Maya up for doing your animation, and then we'll briefly, I'll give some demonstrations and we'll just show some simple animations, and then we'll go from there and we'll get into the graph editor that's in Maya that will help you set timing and work with your animations. So maybe we can get that all done in one. If not, I'll break this into two parts. So let's go ahead and get started. When you're going to do an animation, one of the first things you need to, one of the first questions you have to answer for yourself is, where is the animation going to be used? And that's important because you want to set the frames per second for where the output is for where your animation is going to go. And where you do that is you go up to Window and go to your settings and preferences, and let's look at preferences. That's one way actually to get the animation preferences. The other quick way to get your animation preferences, and this is a shortcut you should learn, is right down here in this corner by this key, which stands for auto key. If you click this little diagram here, it automatically brings up your animation preferences, and in particular it opens up to the time slider. And this is showing the playback for your animation and the way that the settings for the time slider. Actually, where I want to go initially is, let's look at settings. So we go up here and we click on settings, and here's where you set your animation setup. And at the moment it defaults to film, which is 24 frames per second. So when you see your DreamWorks and Pixar movies at the theater, all of those are done at 24 frames per second. If you do something for the web, and it's specifically for the web, sometimes you might go down to something like 15 frames per second. So it will make the size of the file smaller. And the other setting that's probably most important right here is NTSC if you're in the US, or PAL if you're in Europe. NTSC is the American Broadcast Standard, and the American Broadcast Standard for television is at 30 frames per second. In Europe and other parts of the world, that standard is at 25 frames per second. So you want to understand clearly where is your animation going to be used, and really the decision pretty much boils down to, do you want to do it for broadcast or do you want to do it for film? And oftentimes if I'm doing an animation and I'm not quite sure, I tend to pick broadcast. I pick 30 frames per second because it turns out once you have a movie, it's fairly simple to take 30 frames per second and knock it down to 24 or 25 frames per second. If you have created your animation at 24, you can open it up to 30 frames per second, but sometimes you get some artifacts that you might not like. So it's usually easier to go from a higher number down than from a lower number up. For today's tutorial though, we're going to set this and just leave it at film at 24 frames per second. And for the purpose of our class here at Phoenix College, we're always going to do things at 24 frames per second. So you set that, leave that at 24 frames per second. And then your other setting here, this sets up your initial time slider. Now, you aren't restricted you really aren't restricted in terms of the length of an animation that you can make in a Maya file. Okay, so this defaults to a setup that the playhead starts at frame 1, and the visual that you can see is out to 120, and the animation starts at frame 1 and the animation ends at 200. All right, if you get 3 weeks into an animation and decide you really need 400 frames, not 200 frames, you can change this value and you don't have anything to worry about. That's not necessarily the same with these settings. Okay, if you set your animation up and you time all of your animation at 24 frames per second, and then your customer comes back 3 weeks later and says, no, I really wanted that at 30, the best thing to do really is to go back in and retime your animation, and that can sometimes be messy. That's what I'm saying. It's pretty important to really understand ahead of time where you set this up, because changing this value down the road, especially once you're all done, It's not impossible, but it gets a little more painful, and can get real painful depending upon what kind of things you did inside your animation. Going back to the time slider, so this sets up the default for the time slider that we have down here, and then the rest of these things have to do with tick marks, and the tick marks are how your keyframes are displayed. There's an option here so you can display time code. What time code is, if you're not familiar with it, it goes in and you can see this number. I just click time code, and so we can see things in terms of time code. Time code is how the movie industry works, and the way that this is displaying things is the going from the left to the right. These are hours, these are minutes, these are seconds, and then these last two zeros are frames. Okay, so if there was a number inside here, if I slide this along, this goes to 21. That's 21. That's 5 seconds and 21 frames in, and this is starting at the 22nd frame, and you can see that right here. This starts at the 22nd frame, so that's what time code is. Rarely you probably would be working with something like time codes in Maya. The only reason you probably would do that is you had film footage and you were syncing to some film footage that was existing. That's probably the only reason you'd want to do that. Everything else, the playback, we'll get into the playback when we have some animations and we can show them. You can set your playback speed to be real time, 24 frames per second. You can set it to play every frame. You can set it to a half speed or twice speed, or you can even go in and you can set a custom speed. For right now, we'll just leave this at real time, 24 frames per second. That's pretty much the preferences. The only reason you pop back and forth into this once you really start editing is very often you may want to change this looping to be, instead of continuous, to be once or to oscillate. And again, once we have an animation up, I can demonstrate that. I'll show you essentially what these two other buttons mean. Let's go ahead and cancel this and close this. The next thing I want to do is just look down here on this panel and your time slider. And the time slider, and over here the Playhead Controller, very much like a DVR. If you've worked in After Effects, if you worked in Final Cut Pro, or if you worked in Premiere Pro, anything that deals with movies, this should not be unfamiliar to you. You basically have a play forward, this play with a red line. What red lines are is once we place keyframes in here, each keyframe will display a red line where that keyframe is. And so this playhead with the red line here says advance the playhead, this is the playhead. It will advance the playhead to the next keyframe. This next one is advanced to the next frame, and then this last one here on the right is advanced to the end of the animation. Likewise, going backwards, then this would be take me to the beginning of the animation, take me backwards one frame, take me backwards to the next keyframe, or play my animation backwards. If we go in and down here on the playhead, you can take this, and if I click on this 120 and drag this in, you can see what I'm doing is I'm stretching and increasing my frame resolution in what I can view in my slider up here. Now again, we said the animation was set to be 200 frames in length, and I'm viewing 27. So this number, these inside numbers, are where does my playhead above start and end. So I end at 27 and I start at frame 1. If I take and slide this along, okay, we can see the 67 and the 93, which is the 67 here and the 93 here, and here you see frame 67 and here's frame 93. So my view in my animation up here is from frame 67 to frame 93. This helps you out when you've got a specific animation and you want to just work, and you don't need to see the whole beginning and you don't need to see the whole end, but you need a lot of frame resolution right in this one spot, because I don't know, maybe you've got a character and he's kicking a soccer ball or something like that, and you really want to work on that timing, and so this allows you to zero in on that resolution. I could go back in and I can type 25 here, and that changes this playhead to 25, and I can go in here and change this to 100, and that changes it to 100. Quite honestly, the way I work, I never type in these. I just always go to this playhead and I'll click in here and I'll drag this up, or I'll click over here and I'll drag that out, because it's just so much easier to work with. And then obviously as you slide this around, I'm sliding in time across my whole animation. And like I said, if you decide down the road, gee whiz, 200 frames isn't enough for me to do my job, I really need 400, you can go in here and we can go up to here and I can change that value there, but quite honestly there's no need to do that. Just go in here and say I want 400 frames, and so now I have 400 frames in my animation, and I can see that. Okay, so it's just a whole lot easier to work with that and to do things that way. This indicator right here is where the playhead is at. So you can see my playhead's at frame 67. So this is telling me frame 67. If I know exactly I need to go to frame 325, I can type 325, and that takes the playhead there. Now that doesn't automatically move the slider, so I have to take my slider and pull it this way, and there we can see, yes, the playhead has in fact been put on 325. If I click this back, it takes me back to the beginning, and we're in steps. Took me to 14, take me to 1. Okay, so there, we're back to 1. All right, so that pretty much gets me through showing how the playhead works. There's a few other things with animation here. This has to do with working with animation layers and with character sets. We won't get into that. The next thing is really with keyframes. So we've got some time here. So let's go ahead and let's get started with a simple animation. So what I'm going to do is let's create a ball here. And I'll put it on the grid. Let me stick that right in the center. And for the purpose of demonstration, let me make this so I have a plane going across here, and we can see here this is in the YZ plane, so my Z direction is going this way and my Y is obviously going up. My X actually comes forward and goes back, so at the moment I'm just going to animate in the ZY plane, so that's this way and up and down. And the way you work with animations, I'm going to set this to 50 because I don't need to have 200 in there. The way that animations work is you set keyframes, and a keyframe is where you have defined a specific parameter at a specific time. In this case, we're going to define translations. You can keyframe a lot more than translations. Okay, you can keyframe the color of the material that happens to be in your object. There's numerous things that you can keyframe, but at the moment we're just going to keyframe translations, and in particular I'm going to keyframe translations in Y and translations in Z. So I want to start my animation. Let's take this ball and we're going to pull this over to here. Alright, and we're going to start right there, and let me actually move this down just a little bit. Alright, and I think I'm even going to take that ball and make it just a little bit smaller. And we'll slide him there. So this is my start, and I'm right at frame 1, and the first thing I want to do is I want to keyframe, and I know I'm going to move this only in Y and Z. So Y and Z I want to keyframe, and I want to set the initial keyframe. And we can keyframe manually or we can use auto keyframe. I'm going to walk through both. Initially we're just going to do manual keyframe. So let's go ahead and set a manual keyframe. Now the thing I always tell and reinforce with my students is when you're setting keyframes, there's a procedure you always follow. You set the time, you set the value, you set the key. I'll repeat that. You set the time, you set the value, and then you set the key. If you're using auto keyframe, you set the time and then you set the value. You go back and you change the playhead to a new time and then you set the value. And auto keyframe will then insert a new key every time that you set the time and then you set the value. A new keyframe will be created. So let's do this manually. So I have translate Y and translate Z selected. I right click with my mouse and I say key selected. and we only want to keyframe the selected items. Notice down here I can say key all keyable. That will go in, and if I did that, let's go ahead and do that. It sets keyframes on every parameter here. And I can tell you with confidence, you really don't want to do that. Rarely will you ever want to do that unless you absolutely know that you're going to be moving things in translation, in rotation, in scale, and in visibility. If you absolutely are going to be doing that, then maybe you want to do that. But in general, you don't. Because what it does is it creates a lot more keyframes than what you need. So let me undo that. Let's go back here and we say key selected. So now we've made a keyframe, we've keyframed the Y, and we've keyframed the Z. So we've set a specific value for Y and a specific value for Z at 1. And notice there's a red line here right at the first frame. So now let's go out and we'll go to the 10th frame. And now what I want to do, remember what did I say? You set the time, and now I'm going to set the value. I set the value by moving my object. And so I'm going to move it in Z, and I'm going to move it in Y. So we set the time, we set the value. Now I go over here, I right click, I say key selected, I set the key. So now I have a keyframe right there. Let's go out to set the time to 20. I go over here and I move this, come down. I set the value, and then we go in and we set the key. Now we have a new keyframe at 30 or at 20. Now I set the time to 30 frames in. I go over here, I set the value, right click, key selected. Go out to 40, come down, we go over. So I set the time, set the value, set the key. One more time, set the time, set the value, right click, key selected, set the key. Now let's go back to 0, and we can see that we have keyframes at 1, 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. If I slide my playhead, notice what happens. We have a nice animation. My ball is just bouncing through space here, and it's going in X and Y. And what's going on and why keyframes are so important is, notice, I only had to set a value at time 1, and then I set my next value at time 10. For all these other frames, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, the computer calculates what the position of the ball needs to be. In other words, it takes the first position where the first keyframe is, the next frame where the next keyframe is, and it does an interpolation. And it says, well, if I need to be at this position at frame 10 and I started here at frame 1, what must these mathematically, it calculates where these other values need to be. That the process mathematically doing that is called interpolation. And as you're probably guessing, yes, you can change how that interpolation is. So I can change how my ball will move from frame 1 to frame 10. I can make it go what's called linear, which means each step is equal in X and each step is equal in its Y changes. So in that case, it would take the starting value. If it was linear, I translate Y. The value was 0, and up here the value was 10.853. So each frame step, because there's 10 frames, would be a value of 1.835 for each step in between, if it was a linear interpolation. Turns out the default for Maya is not a linear. It's it has a smoothing in and out, and you can kind of see that as this ball moves. There's an easing. It comes up and it comes down, and we'll look at that when we look at the graph editor. But for right now, for the purpose of this demonstration, you can see that this is moving in a fashion that the computer does all the internal interpolations, and it's a smooth interpolation. The next thing I wanted to show is you can take keyframes and you can do a copy and paste. And you can also do delete. So let's say I didn't want these keyframes right here. How do I do that? How do I get rid of those? Well, the simplest way is you just right click on here, you go down here and you just say delete. And I click on that and those keyframes were deleted. I can undo that. Control Z, that puts them back. I can copy and paste. Let's say I want this value here at frame 35. I want to jump back to this exact position, so I can go in here and I can copy, and I'll move my playhead to frame 35, and I go in here and I can paste. I can paste it in there, and notice now that at frame 35 I go from frame 30 and I zing right back here to where I was at frame 10, and then I zip back and go down to frame 40. All right, kind of a strange animation, but what it allows you to do is you can cut, copy, and paste keyframe values and place them at different places in the timeline. I think at this point we got 20 minutes into this. I think what I'm going to do here is we will stop this tutorial here, and I will have a part 2 where we'll dig into a lot more of how we go in and we can modify and edit these keyframes, and in particular we'll start getting into the graph editor, which is a very powerful tool to help you work with your animation. So this is Phil with Phil Effects. Thanks a lot, and I'll catch you in part 2.